Please, spare my child. The desperate widow screamed. Then a blood rider Comanche intervened. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The sun hung low over the barren plains, casting long shadows over a small, isolated homestead on the edge of the Comanche territory. The wind carried the scent of dust and distant smoke, signaling the approach of something dangerous. Inside the small cabin, a widow, Emma Caldwell, held her child close, her heart racing as she listened to the sounds of approaching horses. Her husband had been dead for months now, taken by a fever that swept through the settlement. Left with only her son, Caleb, she had struggled to survive in the harsh wilderness. But today, her fight was no longer against nature. It was against a group of ruthless outlaws, men who had already taken everything from her. They had come for Caleb. The outlaw leader, a cruel man named Black Jack, had made it clear that Emma would either submit to him or watch her son die. The pain in her chest was unbearable as she clutched her son tighter, her tears soaking his hair. Please, spare my child, she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. But the outlaws showed no mercy, their laughter echoing in the dry air. They advanced, confident that they would get what they wanted. As Emma's breath caught in her throat, she saw the figure on horseback appear in the distance, moving with purpose across the prairie. The man was alone, a solitary figure riding straight into the path of the outlaws. His silhouette was sharp against the setting sun, a warrior, silent and determined. His steed moved like the wind, its hooves kicking up clouds of dust behind them. The outlaws stopped their advance, eyeing the newcomer warily. The man's presence was unmistakable. He was a Comanche warrior, known as the Blood Rider. He had a reputation, one that the outlaws had heard of but never expected to encounter. He was a legend, a shadow in the night, and to cross him meant certain death. Emma's heart skipped a beat. Was this the help she had prayed for? As the Blood Rider approached, his steely gaze never left the outlaws. He was calm, composed, his face a mask of unreadable emotion. When he reached them, he didn't speak. Instead, he drew his bow with the quiet grace of a seasoned hunter. With a single, fluid motion, an arrow flew from his bow, striking one of the outlaws in the chest before they even had time to react. The outlaws froze in terror. The Blood Rider had no need to say a word. His actions spoke louder than anything he could have said. In seconds, the leader of the outlaws, Black Jack, drew his gun, aiming it directly at the Blood Rider. But the warrior was faster. Before Black Jack could fire, another arrow pierced the air, hitting his hand and sending the revolver clattering to the ground. The other outlaws, now terrified and leaderless, dropped their weapons and fled, scrambling to escape the wrath of the Blood Rider. Emma stood, stunned, as the warrior dismounted and approached her slowly. His eyes were intense, but not unkind. "Your child is safe," he said, his voice deep and calm. Emma could barely believe her ears. The nightmare that had consumed her life was finally over. She looked down at Caleb, who was still trembling in her arms. The warrior didn't wait for thanks. He simply nodded once, his eyes shifting to the horizon as if to say that his work here was done. With a swift motion, he turned and mounted his horse, riding off into the fading light of the evening. Emma watched him disappear, her heart full of gratitude and awe. She would never forget the warrior who had saved her son and shown her the true meaning of bravery and honor. The sun had set, and the night air grew cool as Emma Caldwell stood in the quiet aftermath of the chaos. Her heart was still racing, the sound of her pounding pulse the only thing she could hear as the last of the outlaws fled into the darkness. Caleb, her son, clung to her side, his small hands gripping her dress. He had barely spoken since the moment the Blood Rider had appeared, his wide eyes still filled with fear and awe. The scene outside their cabin had been nothing short of a nightmare, but now it was over. The warrior who had saved them was gone, leaving only the dust and silence in his wake. Emma turned slowly, her legs shaky as she stepped away from the cabin door. She was still trying to process what had happened. A Comanche warrior, a man she had heard of in stories, had just saved her son and her life. She had seen him take down 5 outlaws without breaking a sweat, his presence as commanding as the wind that howled across the plains. His skill with the bow, his calm demeanor in the face of danger, it was all like something out of a dream. But he had been real, and he had saved them. Emma couldn't help but feel a mixture of gratitude and confusion. What did it mean for her now? Was she supposed to be grateful? Was she supposed to do something in return? She looked down at Caleb, who was now holding her hand, his small fingers wrapped tightly around hers. The boy had been through so much. His world had been turned upside down in a matter of days, and she could see the fear still lingering in his eyes. "Mama, who was he?" Caleb asked in a soft voice, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Emma kneeled down, pulling him into her arms. She kissed the top of his head and looked toward the horizon, where the last traces of daylight were fading. "I don't know, Caleb," she whispered. "But he's a hero, and he saved us." She held him tighter, as if trying to shield him from the rest of the world, from the dangers they had just survived. The sounds of the night were now louder than before, the chirping of crickets and the occasional howl of a coyote in the distance. Emma stood up slowly, taking one last look at the empty prairie before turning back toward the cabin. The cabin that, for the first time in months, felt a little safer. She walked inside, Caleb following closely behind. The flickering light of the oil lamp cast long shadows on the walls. She had barely begun to settle into the routine of grief and survival after losing her husband. But now, things were different. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a glimmer of hope. That hope, however, was mixed with a sense of uncertainty. The blood rider, the warrior who had saved them, was a part of a world Emma barely understood. A world of native tribes, of warriors and hunters, a world far removed from the one she had known. He had come and gone without a word, without asking for anything in return. He was a mystery to her, and though he had helped them, Emma could not shake the feeling that this was not the end of their story. She had heard of men like him, the ones who roamed the wilderness, not belonging to anyone but themselves. The ones who made their own rules, who lived by a code that Emma could never fully grasp. The kind of man who might ride back into her life when she least expected it. She sat down at the small table in the corner of the room, Caleb perched on her lap. She looked at him, and for the first time in a long while, she smiled. "We're safe now, Caleb. You and me. We'll be okay." But deep down, Emma knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The memory of the outlaws, of the fear in Caleb's eyes, would stay with her. And the memory of the blood rider, the warrior who had appeared out of nowhere to save them, would linger in her mind, a reminder that the world was full of surprises, both good and bad. As the night stretched on, Emma found herself thinking about the warrior, wondering if they would cross paths again. The thought made her uneasy, but also curious. The world of the Comanche was vast and unknown to her, but in a way, she felt a connection to it now. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to her story than she had ever realized. The wind howled outside, but inside, the small cabin felt warmer. Emma kissed Caleb once more and tucked him into bed. As she sat by the lamp, her thoughts turned to the warrior once again. She would never forget what he had done for them. But what would happen next? Only time would tell. It had been 2 days since the blood rider had left, and the world felt different to Emma Caldwell. The air seemed a little fresher, the sounds of the wilderness less threatening. Her mind replayed the moment when he had ridden off into the setting sun, disappearing as quietly as he had arrived. But now, as the sun rose on a new day, Emma found herself troubled by a question she could not shake. What was she supposed to do now? The peace she had found in the aftermath of the outlaw's departure was fragile. It had been too easy to think that things would go back to normal, that she and Caleb could go back to their quiet lives, as if nothing had happened. But she knew better. Her son had seen violence, and so had she. They were changed, and that sense of change weighed heavily on Emma's heart. As the days passed, life continued as it had before, but Emma couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something more was about to happen. Her small homestead, which had once seemed like a place of safety, now felt like a temporary refuge. It was a hard thing to admit, but Emma realized she was no longer content with simply surviving. The sight of the blood rider, so calm and resolute in the face of danger, had stirred something inside her, a longing for something more than the quiet, lonely existence she had known. She didn't want to live in fear anymore, not for herself, and certainly not for Caleb. The memory of the Comanche warrior lingered, like a spark waiting to ignite. Was it possible he might come back? Was it foolish to even think that way? As Emma sat in the cabin, mending a tear in Caleb's coat, she heard something in the distance. The sound of hooves on the dirt road. Her heart skipped. She looked out the window, half expecting to see the familiar silhouette of the blood rider returning. But it wasn't him. A group of riders appeared over the hill, moving slowly but steadily toward her homestead. They were not outlaws this time. These men were different. They wore the colors of a nearby settlement, a group of traders and ranchers who had made their homes a few miles away. Emma's first instinct was to run. The last time she'd seen men approach her home, it had been under far different circumstances. But these men didn't look threatening. They were simply riders, their horses tired, their expressions calm. She hesitated, but after a long moment, she opened the door. The leader of the group was a tall man with a weathered face and a wide-brimmed hat. He dismounted gracefully, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He nodded to Emma, his expression kind but curious. "Ma'am, I hope we're not disturbing you," he said, his voice deep and steady. Emma raised an eyebrow but remained silent. "We've been passing through these parts and heard about what happened here. Thought we'd check in on you, make sure everything's all right." Emma didn't respond immediately. Part of her was still wary, unsure of their intentions. She had learned to trust no one, not after everything that had happened. But something about the man's demeanor felt genuine. His tone was respectful, and his eyes held no malice. After a moment, Emma nodded. "Everything's fine," she said quietly. "Just trying to keep things together." The man smiled slightly, sensing her hesitation. "I understand. It's been a rough time for everyone, but I heard that there was an outsider, a warrior, a Comanche, who stepped in and saved you and your son." Emma stiffened at the mention of the blood rider. The memory of his presence, so strong and silent, sent a shiver down her spine. "Yes, he helped us," she replied, her voice almost a whisper. "He saved us from the outlaws." The man nodded, his expression softening. "We heard about him, but those of us who live here aren't used to outsiders like him. Still, there's something about a man who steps in when no one else will." Emma felt a flicker of warmth in her chest at his words. She had never known what it meant to be truly seen by the people around her, not until now. The man stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. "We know the Comanche have their ways, but if you ever need help again, you don't have to face it alone." His offer was simple, but it carried weight. It was the kind of offer Emma had never received before, a promise of protection, of solidarity. She looked at the man, then at the other riders who had gathered behind him. They all watched her with a quiet intensity, as if waiting for her to make a decision. Her heart wavered. This was a turning point. Was she ready to trust again? Was she ready to accept the help of those who had once been strangers? "Thank you," she said, her voice stronger now. "We'll be all right for now, but I'll keep that in mind." The man nodded, understanding her reluctance. "We'll be nearby if you need us," he said before turning back to his horse. As the group of riders mounted their steeds and began to leave, Emma stood there for a moment, watching them disappear over the hill. The quiet of the evening returned, but something had shifted in Emma. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel quite as alone. It had been several weeks since the riders from the nearby settlement had stopped by. Emma Caldwell had settled into a new rhythm, one where the quiet life she once knew had now been replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. She could feel Caleb's restlessness growing, the tension in his shoulders when he played outside, the unease in his eyes when night fell. He had changed, just like she had, and no matter how much she wanted to protect him from the harsh realities of their world, she knew she could not shield him forever. Life was no longer just about survival. It was about finding a new way to live. Despite the peace she had found, Emma could not stop thinking about the blood rider. His presence had shaken her, and the more she tried to push the memory of his face and his actions to the back of her mind, the stronger the pull became. It was as though he had planted a seed of something unknown inside her, something that yearned for more than just a simple existence on the edge of the frontier. One afternoon, as Emma was preparing the evening meal, she noticed Caleb staring off into the distance from the porch. His gaze was fixed on something, or rather someone, that she couldn't yet see. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She set the spoon down and walked outside, her eyes following Caleb's line of sight. The silhouette of a lone rider appeared on the horizon. It was not the same group of riders from before, nor was it the familiar figure of the Comanche warrior. This was someone new, yet there was something about the way the rider moved that stirred a feeling of recognition deep within her. Her breath caught in her throat as the rider drew closer. The wind carried a hint of familiarity with it, a subtle strength in the air that made Emma's pulse quicken. As the rider drew nearer, she realized the unmistakable truth. It was him, the Blood Rider. He had returned. The same warrior who had saved them from the outlaws, who had disappeared without a word. The same warrior who had left her with more questions than answers. But this time, it was different. This time, Emma was ready. She stepped forward, her heart racing, and Caleb stood beside her, his small hand gripping her fingers tightly. The Blood Rider slowed his horse as he approached, his eyes locked onto Emma's. He said nothing at first, as if waiting for her to speak. She could feel the weight of his silence, the unspoken understanding that passed between them. Finally, Emma found her voice. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. The Blood Rider's eyes softened, and he answered in a low, calm voice. "I came to see that you were safe. The outlaws you faced were not the last of their kind. There are others." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of truth. Emma nodded slowly, feeling the gravity of his statement. She had known that their small corner of the world was never truly safe, that the peace they had found was fragile, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all the more real. "What do you want from us?" Emma asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. The warrior hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. "I want nothing, but you may need me, and if you do, I will be here." He dismounted from his horse and walked toward them. His movements were fluid and purposeful, and Emma couldn't help but notice the scars that marked his skin, each one telling a story of battles fought and survived. "I will not stay long," he added, his voice steady. "I do not belong in one place for long. But for now, I offer you protection." Emma stood there, processing his words, trying to make sense of them. The man who had saved them, who had appeared from the shadows and disappeared just as quickly, was offering her and Caleb protection again. But this time, the offer was different. He was not just a hero in a moment of crisis. He was a part of a world that Emma didn't understand, a world that she was now beginning to realize was intertwined with her own. Caleb tugged on her sleeve, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "Is he staying, Mama?" he asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Emma knelt down, meeting his gaze. She wasn't sure how to answer. She didn't know what the Blood Rider's return meant, or what it meant for their future. But she knew one thing for certain. The warrior was no longer just a mysterious figure from the past. He was part of their story now. "I don't know, Caleb," Emma said softly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "But he's here now, and that's all that matters." The Blood Rider stood nearby, his presence like a silent guardian, watching over them with a quiet intensity. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, Emma realized that this moment, this feeling of uncertainty and hope, was only the beginning. The life she had known was changing, and there was no turning back now. Whatever the future held, Emma and Caleb were no longer alone. They had a protector, a warrior, who would stay with them for as long as they needed him. It had been a week since the Blood Rider's return, and the days seemed to stretch longer than ever before. Emma had grown accustomed to his presence around their homestead, though she still couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered beneath the surface. The warrior's quiet demeanor was a constant reminder that their lives had changed in ways she could not fully understand. Caleb, however, had adjusted much quicker. The boy had grown fond of the warrior, watching him with wide eyes as he went about his daily tasks, never quite able to understand how someone so fearsome could be so calm and steady. Emma often found Caleb standing just outside the door, looking at the Blood Rider as he practiced his bow or cared for his horse, his movements smooth and efficient, almost like a part of the land itself. Caleb had begun to ask questions about the warrior's past, questions Emma had no answers to. The warrior had never spoken much about himself, only that he was a part of the Comanche people, and that his presence here was simply a matter of honor. Emma, though, had learned something important. The more she knew about the man, the more uncertain she became. There was a darkness about him, a solitude that clung to him like the dust on his boots. He was a protector, yes, but he was also a man who had been shaped by things Emma could not understand, things she was not sure she wanted to know. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the distant mountains, Emma sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames flickering against her skin. Caleb sat next to her, playing with a small wooden toy she had made for him. The blood rider was outside, tending to his horse, his figure dark against the fading light. Emma glanced at him, her mind wandering. Would he stay? Or would he vanish into the wilderness once more, leaving them alone to face whatever dangers awaited? Just as the thought crossed her mind, the blood rider walked into the cabin, his movements graceful yet purposeful. His eyes met Emma's, and for a moment, the weight of his gaze held her captive. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady and calm. Emma's heart skipped a beat. His words were not an invitation for casual conversation. They were a warning. She nodded, feeling the knot in her stomach tighten. Caleb looked up from his toy, sensing the shift in the air. He stood up, his small face full of concern. "Mama," he asked, his voice small. "What's wrong?" Emma smiled gently, brushing a hand through his hair. "Nothing, Caleb. Stay here with your toy. I'll be right back." Caleb hesitated but nodded, his attention turning back to the small wooden figure in his hands. Emma stood up and followed the blood rider outside, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. The sky was clear, the stars beginning to sparkle overhead, but there was a heaviness in the air, a sense that something was about to change. The blood rider led her to a spot just outside the cabin, where they could see the distant horizon. "There are more outlaws," he said, his voice low. "Not far from here. They've been tracking your movements." Emma's stomach dropped at the words. She had known the danger wasn't over, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all the more real. The fear she had buried deep within herself began to rise to the surface. "How long do we have?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The blood rider didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I'll stay with you," he said finally. "But you must prepare. If they come, we won't be able to keep them at bay for long. There are too many of them." Emma's mind raced. She had known they couldn't live in peace forever, but the realization that they were once again vulnerable, completely at the mercy of strangers, was too much to bear. The blood rider's presence, which had once felt like a gift, now felt like a reminder of how fragile their lives truly were. "What should I do?" she asked, the words barely leaving her lips. The warrior met her gaze, his eyes intense, but there was a softness there now, a flicker of something more than the stone-like resolve he usually carried. "You have to decide," he said quietly. "You can stay here and hope they pass, or you can leave, take your son, and find a safer place." His words echoed in her mind, the weight of them sinking deep into her chest. The choice seemed impossible. Leave, and risk everything, or stay and face the unknown. "I can't run forever," Emma said softly, more to herself than to him. "I can't keep Caleb moving from place to place, living in fear." The blood rider studied her for a moment, his face unreadable. "Then we will fight," he said simply. Emma nodded, feeling the strength of his words settle in her heart. She had never been a fighter, but she had fought for survival her entire life. This, she knew, was no different. As the night deepened and the stars shone brighter above, Emma realized that this was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when she could no longer run from her fears. She was no longer alone, and whatever came next, they would face it together. The night that followed the blood rider's words was long and restless. Emma sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames a small comfort against the cold, harsh reality of the situation. Caleb slept soundly beside her, unaware of the danger that was closing in on them. Her thoughts kept turning over and over, the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. They couldn't stay here forever. But could she really leave everything behind? The blood rider had made his choice clear. They would fight together. But how could she, a widow who had barely survived these past months, ever hope to face what was coming with any sense of strength? The wind outside howled, as if urging her to make a decision. Emma looked down at Caleb, his face peaceful in sleep, and a fierce determination surged through her. She could not, would not, let her son grow up in fear. Not again. The next morning came quickly, the sun rising with a new sense of urgency. Emma stood up, stretching her stiff muscles, and walked to the door. The Blood Rider was already out, preparing his horse, checking his weapons with a practiced efficiency that sent a chill down her spine. She stepped outside, the cool morning air biting at her skin. "We'll need to fortify the cabin," the Blood Rider said without looking up. "They'll be here by nightfall." Emma nodded, though her heart was heavy. She had never been one to wield a weapon, never imagined that she would need to. But today was different. She was no longer just a widow trying to survive. Today, she was a mother defending her child, and she would do whatever it took. The Blood Rider handed her a rifle, its weight unfamiliar in her hands. "Know how to use it?" he asked. Emma hesitated, but then remembered the hunting trips her late husband had taken her on, how she had learned to fire a gun, even if she hadn't done so in years. She gripped the rifle, steadying herself. "I know," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves churning in her stomach. They spent the day preparing, setting traps around the cabin, hiding supplies, and positioning themselves where they could defend the homestead. Caleb, curious but frightened, asked 1,000 questions, but Emma didn't have answers for him. All she could do was assure him that they would be safe, that the warrior would protect them. As the day drew to a close and the sky darkened, Emma's nerves were on edge. The wind had died down, and an eerie quiet had settled over the land. Her fingers itched for the rifle, and she felt her pulse quicken with each passing minute. The Blood Rider had taken up position near the edge of the property, his eyes scanning the horizon, alert to any movement. Emma stood at the window, her hand on the rifle, waiting. She could hear the distant sound of hooves, the steady rhythm of approaching riders. They were coming. The outlaws had arrived. Emma's heart thudded in her chest as she looked at Caleb, who was now clutching his toy, his small face pale with fear. She kneeled beside him and brushed a lock of hair from his face. "Stay low and stay quiet, Caleb. We'll be okay, I promise." Caleb nodded, though his eyes were wide with fear. He was so much like his father, and yet so much like her too. She could feel the weight of her promise pressing down on her. A loud crack broke the silence, followed by another and another. The Blood Rider had fired the first shot. The outlaws had made their move. Emma's hand tightened around the rifle as she moved to her position. She wasn't going to be a passive participant in this fight. She had survived too much to let fear control her now. The sound of gunfire grew louder as the battle unfolded outside. Emma's heart pounded, but her hands were steady. She aimed the rifle and fired, the shot ringing out in the night. Her target dropped, and she quickly ducked behind cover, her breath coming in short bursts. The world outside her window had become a blur of gunfire, shouting, and movement. It was chaos, but in the midst of it all, Emma held on to her resolve. She would protect her son. She would survive. The fight seemed to go on forever, but slowly, the gunfire began to fade. The outlaws were retreating, their numbers thinning under the onslaught of the Blood Rider's skill and Emma's unexpected accuracy. It was only when the last of the riders had fled that the silence returned, heavy and unsettling. Emma stood up, her legs weak, her body trembling from the tension and adrenaline. She could hear Caleb's voice calling her name from inside. She stepped cautiously toward the door, her rifle still in hand, and entered the cabin. Caleb rushed into her arms, his fear still evident but mixed with awe. "We did it, Mama," he whispered, his voice filled with relief. Emma held him tight, her heart swelling with pride. "Yes, we did," she whispered back, her voice thick. With emotion, she had done it. They had done it. The Blood Rider stood in the doorway, his figure silhouetted against the fading light. He had been their protector, their strength, but Emma realized now that she was strong in her own right. And with Caleb by her side, there was no enemy they could not face together. The days following the battle were quiet, but Emma could feel the shift in the air. The danger had passed, for now, but the events of the past weeks had changed something in her. She no longer saw herself as just a woman trying to survive the frontier. She had become something more, a protector, a fighter, someone capable of standing her ground. She had fought alongside the Blood Rider, and for the first time since her husband's death, she felt that she was no longer alone. Caleb, too, had changed. The fear that had once clouded his young eyes had been replaced with a quiet strength. He had witnessed the battle, heard the gunfire, and seen what it meant to stand and fight for what mattered. He was no longer just the boy she had protected. He was her partner, her reason for fighting, and she could see in his gaze that he understood the weight of that responsibility. The Blood Rider, however, remained as enigmatic as ever. Though he had stayed after the fight, helping them rebuild and ensuring their safety, he never spoke of his past, his intentions, or what had brought him to their doorstep in the first place. His presence was a constant reminder that there was much about the world Emma didn't understand, but she had learned to trust him. She had no choice. He was their protector, and she had come to respect the quiet strength he exuded. One evening, as Emma sat by the fire, tending to a pot of stew, she heard the familiar sound of hooves approaching. It wasn't the outlaws this time, but rather a lone rider. Emma stood up, her hand instinctively resting on the rifle she kept nearby. Caleb looked up from the floor where he had been playing with a small wooden figure, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Who's that, Mama?" he asked. Emma strained her eyes, trying to make out the figure in the distance. As the rider came closer, she could see the familiar silhouette of the Blood Rider. He was alone, moving slowly, his face hidden beneath the wide brim of his hat. A strange tension filled the air, and Emma felt a knot form in her stomach. Something about this moment felt different, as if the calm they had fought for was about to be tested once more. The Blood Rider dismounted and walked toward her, his eyes scanning the horizon as though he was searching for something. "You need to leave," he said, his voice low but firm. Emma blinked, trying to understand his words. "Leave? What do you mean?" she asked, her heart racing. The Blood Rider's gaze met hers, and for the first time, Emma saw a hint of concern in his eyes. "There is a storm coming," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "Not a storm of weather, but a storm of men. They are gathering. I don't know how many, but I know they're coming for you." Emma's breath caught in her throat. The outlaws had returned. But this time, it was not just a few desperate men. It was something larger, more organized. A raid was coming, and they would not be able to hold off the attack. Emma's mind raced. "How much time do we have?" she asked, fear creeping into her voice. The Blood Rider's face was grim. "A few days, at best." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. What could they do? The cabin, their home, was too small to defend for long. There were too many places to hide, too few weapons, and the terrain around them was too open. She looked at Caleb, who was watching her with wide eyes, sensing the change in the air. "What do we do?" she whispered. The Blood Rider didn't answer immediately. He walked over to the horse, pulling out a map from his saddlebag. He spread it out on the ground, and Emma bent down beside him, her eyes scanning the markings. "I've been scouting the land for days," he said. "There's a canyon to the north, a narrow pass that could serve as a stronghold. We can use it to defend ourselves or escape if necessary." Emma looked at the map, trying to picture the canyon in her mind. It was a good distance away, and the terrain was rough, but it offered some hope. It was their only option. "We'll need to move quickly," Emma said, determination filling her voice. The Blood Rider nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'll help you prepare. We leave at first light." That night, Emma couldn't sleep. Her thoughts were a whirl of plans, of what needed to be done, of what could go wrong. The weight of the decision to leave their home, to abandon everything they had fought for, hung heavily on her heart. But she knew she had no choice. The world outside was unforgiving, and she had a son to protect. She could not let him fall into the hands of those who would harm him. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Emma stood at the door of their cabin, ready to leave behind everything she had known. Caleb stood beside her, his small hand in hers, his trust in her unwavering. The Blood Rider stood at the edge of the homestead, his horse saddled and ready, waiting for them to make their move. They had no idea what lay ahead, but they knew one thing for sure. Whatever storm was coming, they would face it together. The sun had barely risen when Emma, Caleb, and the Blood Rider began their journey northward, away from the cabin that had once been their home. The land around them was quiet, the morning air crisp and sharp against their skin. The peaceful silence of the early hours seemed in sharp contrast to the turmoil that had just begun to unfold in their lives. With each step away from the place they had fought so hard to protect, Emma felt the weight of the decision they had made. They weren't just leaving behind a cabin. They were leaving behind the remnants of a life that, for better or worse, had shaped them. Caleb walked beside her, his small hand tightly gripping hers, his steps determined but hesitant. She could see the worry in his eyes, the questions he dared not ask. He had been through so much already. Too much for a boy his age, and Emma knew that. In his own way, he understood the danger they were in. The Blood Rider moved silently ahead of them, his figure as imposing as ever, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. He hadn't spoken much since their decision to leave, but Emma could sense the quiet determination in him, the same resolve that had kept them safe so far. The landscape around them was rugged, filled with tall, wild grasses and craggy hills. The terrain was tough, but it also offered cover, a place where they could disappear into the land and remain hidden from any pursuing outlaws. Emma didn't look back at the cabin. She couldn't. It had been the center of her life for so long, and leaving it behind felt like admitting defeat. But she knew it wasn't. They were moving forward, to survive, to fight for what was left of their family. As the hours passed, and the sun climbed higher in the sky, the journey grew more difficult. The land they crossed was unforgiving, and Emma's legs ached from the strain. But it was Caleb who worried her most. He had remained quiet for the past hour, walking with his head down, his small feet dragging behind her. She bent down to check on him. "Are you okay, Caleb?" she asked gently. He nodded without looking up, but Emma could see the exhaustion in his face. "I'm fine, Mama." But Emma could tell that wasn't true. Caleb was strong, but even the strongest of hearts could break under the weight of fear and uncertainty. She didn't want to show him how worried she was, but it was hard to keep her own fears in check. They needed to keep moving, though. She gave him a small, reassuring smile, hoping it would ease the worry in his eyes. "We'll rest soon, sweetheart. We just need to get to the canyon." Caleb didn't say anything, but his pace quickened slightly, as if he were trying to keep up with her determination. The Blood Rider had slowed down, sensing that it was time to take a break. He turned toward Emma and nodded toward a small patch of trees ahead, offering them a place to rest. They made their way toward it, and Emma felt a wave of relief wash over her as they sat down beneath the shade of the trees. The Blood Rider, as always, remained vigilant, standing watch while Emma unpacked the small supplies they had brought with them. Caleb sat on the ground, resting his back against the tree, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Emma noticed that he was still pale, still too quiet. She knelt beside him, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "We'll be okay, Caleb," she said softly, even though part of her wasn't sure if she truly believed it. Caleb looked up at her then, his eyes filled with both fear and trust. "Why are we running, Mama?" he asked, his voice small. Emma's heart ached at the question. "We're not running, Caleb," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "We're moving so we can fight back, so we can be safe." Caleb didn't seem fully convinced, but he didn't press the matter. Instead, he leaned against her, his small body trembling with exhaustion. Emma wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. They had been through so much together, and no matter what came next, they would face it as a family. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Emma knew they couldn't rest for long. The outlaws were still out there, still searching for them, and they had no time to waste. They needed to get to the canyon, to the place where they could make their stand. The Blood Rider was already packing up, ready to move again. Emma stood, lifting Caleb into her arms. His small weight was a comfort, reminding her why she had to keep going. "Let's go, Caleb," she said softly, her voice steady despite the uncertainty that still churned in her chest. Caleb nodded, and together, they began the next leg of their journey. The canyon was still a few hours away, but Emma knew it was the only place where they had a chance to defend themselves. They had no idea what would happen once they reached it, but Emma had already made her decision. They would not run anymore. They would fight. With the Blood Rider by their side, they might just stand a chance. The journey to the canyon took longer than Emma had anticipated. The rough terrain made it difficult to move quickly, and they had to stop multiple times for rest, with Caleb growing more tired by the hour. The weight of the situation, the ever-present danger of the outlaws, was starting to wear on her. The peaceful moments between the chaos were becoming harder to come by. Emma could feel the exhaustion settling deep into her bones. Despite the urgency of the situation, she knew they had to keep moving. If they didn't, they would never reach the canyon in time to prepare for the fight that was coming. The Blood Rider remained as calm as ever, his sharp eyes scanning the land around them, always alert, always prepared. His silence was a comfort. In a way, though Emma had learned that beneath his quiet demeanor lay a man who had seen far more than she could imagine. He didn't speak often, but when he did, it was always with purpose. As they continued their trek, Emma found herself thinking more and more about the warrior. Who was he really? Why had he come to their aid? What was his story? These questions lingered in her mind, but she knew better than to ask him directly. Some things, she knew, were not meant to be understood. Caleb had grown quieter as the day wore on, his small face pale with fatigue. Emma had to carry him part of the way, his tiny hands gripping her as she made her way up the rocky incline. She felt his weight, but she didn't mind. She would carry him to the ends of the earth if she had to. As night began to fall, they reached a small clearing just outside the canyon. The blood rider stopped, turning to face Emma. "This is as far as we go for now," he said, his voice steady. "We'll make camp here." Emma nodded, feeling a mix of relief and tension. They had made it this far, but they weren't safe yet. The outlaws were still out there, and the canyon, though a good defensive position, wouldn't hold for long if they were caught off guard. The blood rider moved quickly, setting up a fire and preparing a small meal with the rations they had left. Emma sat down beside Caleb, who had already fallen asleep in her lap. She watched the flames flicker in the growing darkness, her thoughts swirling. She couldn't help but feel the weight of everything they had gone through. The fear, the violence, the constant uncertainty, it was all too much. But she knew they couldn't turn back now. They had come too far. They had to stay strong. The blood rider sat a little distance away, his back to her, watching the horizon. He had barely touched his food, his mind clearly elsewhere. Emma wanted to ask him what he was thinking, but she didn't. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, and she respected his silence. After a few moments, the blood rider finally stood up. "I'll keep watch tonight," he said, his voice low. "You and your son get some rest." Emma wanted to argue, wanted to say that they should take turns, but she didn't. She knew the warrior's way. He would not be swayed. Instead, she simply nodded. "Thank you." He gave her a slight nod before disappearing into the shadows, his form blending seamlessly with the night. Emma turned her attention back to Caleb, her heart swelling with love for the boy she had fought so hard to protect. As she stroked his hair, her thoughts turned to the future. What would tomorrow bring? Would they be able to defend themselves? Could they really fight back and keep their home safe? The uncertainty was overwhelming, but Emma knew one thing for sure. She would never stop fighting for Caleb. Not now, not ever. The night passed slowly, the sounds of the wilderness around them occasionally broken by the distant calls of coyotes and the soft crackling of the fire. Emma stayed awake as long as she could, her mind never at ease, always listening for the slightest sound that might signal danger. But the night remained quiet, and when she finally did close her eyes, it was with the understanding that tomorrow would bring another challenge. As the first light of dawn broke across the sky, Emma woke to find the blood rider already preparing to leave. He was already mounted on his horse, the reins in his hand, his eyes scanning the horizon once more. Emma stood, stretching her stiff muscles, and picked Caleb up, who had already woken and was rubbing his eyes. The time for rest was over. The blood rider led the way, and Emma followed, carrying Caleb in her arms. They would continue on their journey, knowing that the canyon was still a distance away. There was no turning back. As they moved forward, Emma could feel the weight of the decision they had made pressing on her. But there was something else, too. A glimmer of hope. They had survived this long. They would survive what was coming next. The canyon might be their last stand, but it would also be their fight for freedom. And as long as they had each other, Emma knew they had a chance. The journey to the canyon felt like an eternity. Emma, Caleb, and the blood rider had been traveling for hours, and though they had made good progress, Emma could feel the weight of exhaustion creeping up on her. The landscape around them had become more barren as they pushed farther from their homestead, the towering rocks of the canyon barely visible on the horizon. The air was dry and hot, the sun beating down relentlessly, but Emma knew they couldn't afford to stop. They were too close now, and the threat of the outlaws still loomed over them like a dark cloud. The blood rider led the way with quiet precision, his eyes always scanning the landscape for any sign of movement. He seemed unaffected by the heat, moving with the same steady pace that had guided them since the beginning of their journey. Emma, on the other hand, could feel the toll the day was taking on her body. Her legs ached, her throat was dry, and Caleb's constant weight in her arms made it harder to keep up. She glanced down at him, his small face pale with exhaustion, his eyes dull from the long hours of travel. "We'll rest soon, Caleb," she said softly, her voice steady despite her own fatigue. Caleb looked up at her, his tiny hand gripping hers tighter, but he didn't say anything. He was too tired to protest, and Emma didn't want to admit just how worried she was for him. She had promised to keep him safe, but every step they took felt like they were racing against time. The canyon was still a good distance away, and the outlaws were not far behind. The Blood Rider had mentioned that they would reach the canyon by nightfall, but Emma wasn't sure how much longer she could keep going. She needed to rest, to regroup, but there was no time for that. The survival of her son, her family, depended on making it to the canyon. As the hours passed and the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the Blood Rider stopped suddenly, raising a hand to signal the others to halt. Emma froze, her heart skipping a beat. Something was wrong. The rider's sharp gaze scanned the horizon, his body tense with alertness. Emma followed his line of sight, but she couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Blood Rider didn't answer immediately. He remained still, eyes fixed on the distant ridge. Then, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. "They're here," he said, his voice low and calm. "The outlaws. They found us." Emma's blood ran cold. She felt a surge of panic rising in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. They couldn't afford to panic. Not now. Not when they were so close. "How many?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "Enough to make it difficult," the Blood Rider replied, turning toward her. "We need to move quickly. The canyon is just ahead. We'll make it there before they catch up, but we have to move now." Emma nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She picked up Caleb, holding him close to her chest as she followed the Blood Rider. She didn't ask any more questions. She didn't have time to. The outlaws were closing in, and their chance to escape was slipping away by the second. They moved fast, pushing their bodies to the limit as they made their way toward the canyon. Emma could feel the strain of the day's journey in every step, but she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Caleb's small weight in her arms felt like an anchor, reminding her of why she was doing this. He was her reason for pushing forward, her reason for surviving. The canyon was so close now, Emma could see it in the distance, the narrow pass that would be their last stand. The Blood Rider led the way, his movements swift and precise, and Emma followed as best she could, her breath ragged with exhaustion. They had reached the base of the canyon when the sound of horses' hooves grew louder behind them. The outlaws were closing in faster than they had hoped. Emma turned her head, her heart in her throat. The outlaws were on horseback, their figures silhouetted against the fading light of the day. They were gaining on them. The Blood Rider turned sharply, pulling his bow from his back and knocking an arrow in a single fluid motion. Emma's heart raced. This was it. There was no more running. They were going to have to fight. She could hear Caleb's soft breath against her chest as she hugged him tighter, wishing there was more she could do to protect him. The Blood Rider didn't hesitate. He fired the first shot, the arrow whizzing through the air and hitting one of the outlaws square in the chest. The outlaw fell from his horse with a heavy thud, but the others kept coming, charging toward them with wild abandon. Emma's heart raced as the Blood Rider fired again, the bowstring singing as the second arrow found its mark. But there were too many of them, and they were closing in fast. Emma gripped her rifle, her fingers shaking as she took aim at the approaching outlaws. She wasn't a trained fighter, but she had learned enough to know how to protect her family. She fired, and the sound of the shot echoed through the canyon. One of the outlaws fell, but there were still more. The Blood Rider continued to fire, his arrows flying with deadly precision. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept fighting. She would not let them take her son. She would not let them win. The outlaws were closing in, their shouts echoing off the canyon walls as they charged forward. Emma's heart raced, the blood pounding in her ears, but she held her ground. The sound of arrows whistling through the air was punctuated by the crack of rifle fire. She could hear the Blood Rider's bowstring snap as he fired again, taking down another outlaw, but there were too many, and they were too close. Emma's fingers trembled as she clutched the rifle tighter, trying to steady her aim. She was not a soldier, not a warrior, but she was a mother, and she would do anything to protect Caleb. The canyon walls seemed to close in on her as the outlaws pressed forward, their horses kicking up dust, their guns drawn. The Blood Rider moved like a shadow, swift and precise, firing his bow with deadly accuracy, but even he was beginning to tire. Emma could see the desperation in his eyes as he fired again, but the outlaws were relentless, their numbers overwhelming. Caleb was still clinging to her side, his small hand gripping her tightly. She could feel his heartbeat against her chest, his fear palpable in the air. She couldn't let him see her fear. She had to stay strong for him. She had to stay alive for him. "Stay down, Caleb," she shouted her voice breaking the tension in the air. Caleb nodded, hiding behind a large boulder as Emma rose to her feet, aiming her rifle at the nearest outlaw. Her hands were shaking, but she squeezed the trigger, sending another shot into the dust. The outlaw fell, but his comrades kept coming. The sound of hooves grew louder, and Emma could feel the ground tremble as the outlaws rushed toward them. She was running out of time, running out of options. "We need to move," the Blood Rider shouted as he fired once more. "The canyon's our only chance." Emma turned to him, her heart in her throat. She could see the determination in his eyes, but she could also see the exhaustion, the weariness of someone who had fought too long, too hard. She nodded, grabbing Caleb's hand and pulling him toward the narrow pass. They were almost there, almost within reach of safety, but the outlaws weren't giving up. Emma could hear them shouting, their voices full of fury. She didn't look back, couldn't look back. They had no choice but to keep moving, to get to the canyon, to survive. As they neared the pass, Emma could feel the heat of the day bearing down on her, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her legs were weak, her body aching, but she pushed forward, ignoring the pain. The Blood Rider had already taken up position at the edge of the canyon, his bow drawn, ready to fight. Emma felt a surge of pride for the man who had become their protector. He had been their strength, their guiding force through the chaos, and now, he was the one holding the line. She didn't hesitate. She lifted her rifle once more, taking aim at the closest outlaw, and fired. Her shot hit its mark, and the outlaw fell. But more were coming, and they were getting closer. The Blood Rider fired again, his aim true, but there were still too many. Emma could hear the sound of hooves behind her, the outlaws gaining ground. But they had reached the narrow pass, the only place where they had any chance of survival. The canyon walls rose up on either side of them, and for the first time, Emma felt a flicker of hope. They had made it this far. They could make it the rest of the way. The outlaws were nearly upon them when the Blood Rider signaled for Emma to move forward. Without a second thought, she grabbed Caleb and ran, pushing through the narrow pass with all the strength she could muster. The sound of gunfire rang in the air, and she could feel the heat of the battle behind her, but she didn't stop. The canyon was their final refuge, their last stand, and they would make it count. She could hear the Blood Rider firing behind them, his arrows striking down one outlaw after another. Emma kept moving, her legs burning, her breath ragged, but she couldn't stop now. They had no choice but to keep going. The canyon walls seemed to stretch on forever, but as they pushed forward, Emma began to feel the weight of the battle lifting, the pressure of the fight easing. They had made it to the heart of the canyon, a narrow crevice that offered just enough cover to make their stand. The outlaws, still in pursuit, were now just a few steps behind. The Blood Rider stood ready, his bow drawn, his eyes locked on the approaching riders. Emma didn't hesitate. She took her position beside him, Caleb crouching low beside her, and together, they prepared to make their final stand. The canyon would be their last defense, and they would fight for their lives. The outlaws were close now, but Emma knew that they weren't going to take her son. Not today, not while she still had breath in her lungs. With a fierce determination, she aimed her rifle, and the battle for survival began anew. The canyon walls loomed higher as Emma, Caleb, and the Blood Rider took their positions. The air was thick with tension, and the sound of hooves grew louder by the second. They had reached the narrowest part of the canyon, where the rocks rose steeply on either side, and the ground beneath their feet was uneven, making it the perfect place for their stand. The Blood Rider stood tall, his bow in hand, eyes fixed on the distant riders charging toward them. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she crouched behind a large boulder, Caleb's small hand clutched tightly in hers. She could feel his fear, his body trembling beside her, but she didn't have time to comfort him. They were outnumbered, but they still had the advantage of the terrain. Emma's hands shook as she checked the rifle once more, her fingers cold despite the heat of the day. She wasn't a fighter, not in the way the Blood Rider was, but she had learned to aim, to shoot, and now it was time to put everything she had learned into practice. The outlaws were closing in, their figures growing clearer with each passing moment. The Blood Rider raised his bow, his aim steady, as he released the first arrow. It struck its target, a loud grunt filling the air as one of the outlaws fell from his horse. Emma's heart raced. They were not backing down. The outlaws had come for them, and they were ready to fight for their lives. Emma fired her rifle, the shot ringing out, but it missed its mark. The recoil sent a jolt through her body, but she steadied herself. She couldn't afford to miss again. Caleb's eyes were wide as he watched the action unfold, his small body hidden behind the boulder, but his curiosity getting the best of him. "Mama, are we going to be okay?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the noise of the battle. Emma squeezed his hand, her voice low and firm. "We're going to be fine, Caleb. Stay down and stay quiet." Her heart broke at the fear in his voice, but there was no time to reassure him with words. She had to stay focused. The Blood Rider fired again, and another outlaw fell, but more kept coming. Emma took another shot, this time hitting her target. One outlaw fell, and the others hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach. It was just a brief moment of hesitation, but it was enough to give them a slight advantage. The Blood Rider moved quickly, taking advantage of their uncertainty. His arrows flew with precision, each one finding its mark as he continued to protect them. Emma fired again, her aim more confident this time, and another outlaw dropped from his horse. But the odds were still against them. The outlaws regrouped, their numbers overwhelming. Emma's breath quickened as she fired again, but the recoil sent another sharp pain through her shoulder. She winced but didn't stop. She couldn't. Caleb was depending on her. The Blood Rider's steady presence beside her kept her grounded, but even he seemed to be running out of time. The outlaws were closing in, and they had no place left to retreat. The canyon pass was narrow, but it wasn't enough to stop the onslaught. As one of the outlaws raised his gun to fire at the Blood Rider, Emma reacted instinctively. She fired once more, her shot true, and the outlaw fell, his gun slipping from his hand as he hit the ground. The Blood Rider turned briefly, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since the fight began. There was a silent understanding between them, a mutual respect. "You're doing well," he said, his voice low but full of approval. Emma nodded, her body trembling from the adrenaline, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to. Caleb was still by her side, still trusting her to protect him. As the last of the outlaws charged forward, the Blood Rider took one final shot, his bowstring snapping in the air. The arrow struck the last rider, sending him toppling from his horse. The canyon fell silent, the battle over. Emma stood, her legs unsteady as she lowered her rifle, the weight of the battle settling heavily on her shoulders. The outlaws were either dead or scattered, and for the first time since the fight began, she allowed herself to breathe. But the victory felt hollow. They had survived, yes, but at what cost? The Blood Rider walked toward them, his steps slow but deliberate. His eyes scanned the surroundings, but there was no sign of any more threats. "We've won for now," he said, his voice calm. "But we can't stay here long. They will come back, and we need to keep moving." Emma nodded, the reality of their situation settling in once more. "We will," she said quietly, her voice filled with both relief and dread. Caleb looked up at her, his small face filled with awe and exhaustion. "Are we safe now, Mama?" he asked, his voice small. Emma knelt down beside him, pulling him into her arms. "For now, yes," she whispered, her heart full of love and fear. "But we'll keep moving. We'll keep fighting." The Blood Rider gave them both a final look, his gaze unreadable, before turning to leave. Emma followed, Caleb still in her arms, knowing that their journey was far from over. They had survived, but the world around them was still full of danger, and she would do whatever it took to keep her son safe. The canyon had been their refuge, but it was just one small victory in a much larger fight. The days that followed the battle in the canyon were some of the hardest Emma had ever known. They had made it through the fight, yes, but the tension never truly left. The Blood Rider had kept his word, guiding them through the harsh terrain with a quiet determination, but even he seemed unsettled. Emma could see the toll it was taking on him, his movements slower now, his gaze more distant. The world outside the canyon felt like an endless stretch of dangers, each one more threatening than the last. Emma knew that the outlaws would eventually regroup, and they couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. But as they continued their journey, something changed inside her. She was no longer the frightened widow who had lost everything. She was someone stronger, someone who would do whatever it took to keep her son safe. Every day, as they traveled farther into the wilderness, Emma's resolve hardened. The canyon had been a victory, but it was just one step in their fight for survival. They had no illusions about the road ahead. There were more dangers, more challenges to face. But for the first time since her husband had died, Emma felt a spark of hope. Caleb had seen things no child should ever witness. But he had also learned something essential: survival. He had watched his mother fight for him, and that had changed everything. The bond between them, already strong, had deepened in ways Emma couldn't fully understand. They were more than just mother and son now. They were partners, bound by a shared experience that would shape them for the rest of their lives. One morning, as they walked through a dense forest, the sound of a horse's hooves echoed through the trees. Emma tensed, instinctively reaching for her rifle. The blood rider was already on alert, his eyes scanning the area. They stopped, listening. The sound was close. The blood rider signaled for Emma and Caleb to stay behind the trees, and Emma obeyed, her heart hammering in her chest. She could hear the horse approaching, its rider unaware of their presence. The tension in the air was thick as the sound of the hooves grew louder. But then it stopped. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Had they been spotted? She gripped her rifle tighter, prepared for the worst. But then a figure emerged from the trees. It wasn't an outlaw. It was a man, alone, riding a chestnut horse. His clothes were worn, his face weathered by the sun, but there was something familiar about him. As he rode closer, Emma's heart skipped a beat. It was one of the traders from the settlement they had passed through days ago. His name was Jonah, and he had offered help when they had first passed through. "Well, I'll be damned," Jonah said, spotting them from a distance. His voice was rough, but there was no mistaking the surprise in his tone. "I didn't think I'd find you folks out here." Emma stepped forward, cautiously lowering her rifle. "Jonah," she said, her voice steady but guarded. "What are you doing here?" Jonah smiled, though it was a tired expression. "Looking for you, actually. I didn't want to leave things unfinished after what happened at your cabin. Word travels fast, and I heard about the trouble you ran into. Thought you could use a hand." Emma eyed him warily. She didn't trust easily, not after everything that had happened. But there was something about Jonah's sincerity that made her hesitate. "You came all this way just to help us?" she asked. Jonah nodded. "I've seen the kind of people you're up against, and I know you're not the type to back down. But the world's a lot more dangerous now, especially with those outlaws still out there." Emma looked at the blood rider, who was silently observing the exchange, his face unreadable. She could see the caution in his eyes, too, and she understood why. There was a lot more at stake now than just survival. They had to trust the right people. After a long pause, Emma made her decision. "We're not out of danger yet," she said, "but we'll need help if we're going to make it through." Jonah's face softened. "I knew you'd say that. I've got a camp nearby, a place I've set up for when things get too rough. You can stay there for a while, regroup, and figure out what comes next." Emma nodded, feeling a small flicker of relief. For the first time in days, she could see a possible way forward. She glanced down at Caleb, who was watching her with wide eyes, and she felt a surge of love for him. They had come so far, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, Emma knew that with each step, they were one step closer to something resembling peace. The blood rider turned toward them, his decision already made. "Let's go," he said, his voice low. "We need to move before the outlaws come back." Jonah turned his horse, and the group began moving, the sense of urgency pushing them forward. They had survived the canyon. They had survived the battle. And now, together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. The journey was far from over, but Emma knew that with the blood rider by her side, and the possibility of new allies like Jonah, they might just have a chance after all. In this gripping tale of survival, adventure, and resilience, the journey unfolds through the eyes of a widow and her young son as they face the dangers of the wild frontier. When outlaws threaten their safety, they find an unexpected ally in a mysterious Comanche warrior, known only as the Blood Rider. As they battle against overwhelming odds, Their journey takes them deep into the rugged landscape, where every step could lead to safety or certain death. This story captures the essence of Western stories, blending action, suspense, and emotional depth as they fight for survival in a harsh and unforgiving world. The fight is far from over, and as the group heads toward a narrow canyon, they must rely on each other to stand their ground against the oncoming storm. Throughout this Western story, readers are immersed in a world where every decision could mean life or death, and the true strength of characters is tested in the face of adversity. From the quiet moments of reflection to the heart-pounding battles, the stakes continue to rise. In the end, they are left to question their future in a world full of danger and uncertainty. Will they find peace, or will the fight continue? This Western story holds nothing back, delivering unforgettable moments and powerful themes of survival, loyalty, and the human spirit. Join this remarkable journey where courage is the ultimate weapon, and the bonds formed through struggle may just be the key to overcoming the greatest challenges of all. The legacy of Western stories comes alive in this gripping, high-stakes adventure that will leave you eagerly turning the pages, wondering what happens next.